All right, so here we have the gluteal group. So the gluteal group is made up of the glute maximus muscle here. Then we have the glute medius. And then underneath that, we have the glute minimus. We have this TFL muscle here, the tensor fasciae latae. This muscle functions pretty strongly as a hip abductor. But we'll start with the biggest one first, the glute maximus muscle. So this muscle functions primarily as a hip extensor. Any exercise where you're doing any kind of hip extension movement, it's going to train the glutes. So whether it's squats, deadlifts, split squats, GHD hip extensions, the 45-degree hip extensions, those are all great glute exercises. One of the things to note about the glute maximus, so the glute kind of wraps around the hip this way, kind of at this 45-degree angle. So if we want to isolate the glute maximus muscle, although it functions most primarily as a hip extensor, but if we kind of abduct the hip a little bit so the foot kind of comes out to the side, and then when we flex the hip by basically, think of it as kind of pointing your foot over to your opposite shoulder, and you kind of work through that plane of motion where you bring your foot up to your opposite shoulder, and then you're extending it out again in this kind of cross pattern across the body. That's going to really work that glute maximus muscle. Yeah, there's not a lot of great exercises for that. But we do see how the hip does get into that kind of end range position when we do any kind of back extension type exercise where we abduct the hips and then we externally rotate the feet a lot. That end range motion really gets a peak contraction in the glute maximus more so than just keeping the feet together. And it also helps reduce the contribution of the hamstrings to the exercise, so you make it more of a pure glute exercise. In terms of training that lengthened position, your options really kind of come down to dumbbells and cables. There's not a lot of great exercises for kind of training the glute through that kind of X pattern across the body. But with those, you can focus on that lengthened position. If you do kind of an externally rotated, abducted version of the hip extension exercises, you can train that end range. And then especially with split squats and those types of exercises, you kind of end up working that mid range a lot, even if the force production is kind of biased more towards hip extension. Another way to really kind of emphasize the way the glute functions is your skater jumps. So your skater jumps almost mimic the orientation of the forces with the glute maximus almost perfectly, because you're coming down, you're getting that hip flexion, and then you're generally allowing the leg to kind of come across the body a little bit where you're pointing your knee kind of towards that opposite shoulder. And then you're extending out of that in this combined abduction and hip extension. That's the main way you would train the glute maximus. So here we have the glute medius. So if we look at the glute medius, this one's not as much of a hip external rotator as the glute maximus. So this one's oriented more to allow for kind of a similar action as the glute maximus, but it's going to be more oriented in the frontal plane. So where the glute maximus is probably more of a 45-degree angle of combined frontal and sagittal plane movement, the glute medius is going to be a little bit more in kind of a 30-degree. So if you kind of allow the foot to sort of cross out in front of the body, and then through adduction, and then sweep it back up through abduction, that's going to train the glute medius a lot. And that's really where you're going to see kind of development of this upper glute muscle here. And then we look at the glute minimus here, get rid of the TFL. So the glute minimus functions as a hip abductor, but also because of its attachment point here, on sort of the front of the femur, it's also a bit of a hip flexor. So if you're really going to isolate the motion of the glute minimus, you end up doing kind of this knee flexion combined with internal rotation into abduction movement, which you can do if you attach any kind of dumbbell to your foot. It's really easy to do. So that's a great way to kind of train the glute minimus. So in general, when you're training the gluteal group, you see a pretty wide variety of movements the glutes are capable of. And so the glutes are kind of analogous to the deltoids of the shoulder, where the attachment points of the muscle fan out across a large part of the skeleton. So which allows the glutes to essentially contribute to hip flexion, hip extension, hip abduction, hip external rotation, and hip internal rotation. Depending on which motion you do or which combination of movements, you can bias which muscle you're working pretty significantly. But in general, hip extension is going to train more of the glute maximus. Hip abduction is going to work more of the glute medius and the glute minimus. And the glute minimus is also going to be worked more by hip abduction combined with hip flexion. So that's your gluteal group. Those are things to consider with your gluteal group training. The TFL is pretty much it's going to be really similar to the glute minimus, where any kind of hip flexion combined with abduction is going to really train that TFL. So anyways, that's your gluteal / abductor group.